History is filled with frightening leaders, cruel kings, and rulers who pushed their power too far. But among all these names, there is one emperor whose story still shocks the world. Nero, the ruler of ancient Rome. He was a man who mixed charm with madness, intelligence with cruelty, and deep emotion with dangerous obsession. His name has become a byword for tyranny. But his life was far more complex and bizarre than just simple evil. This is the story of the artist, the murderer, the performer, and the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. Nero's journey to the throne began with a web of ambition and blood, mostly spawned by his mother, Agrippina the Younger. She was a woman who knew how to play the game of power in Rome better than anyone. Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of the first emperor, Augustus, and the sister of the infamous Caligula. After a series of political maneuvers, she married her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius. But marriage wasn't enough. Her ultimate goal was to see her son, Nero, on the throne. To do this, she convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, pushing aside Claudius's own son, Britannicus. In the year 54 AD, Emperor Claudius died suddenly. Most historians believe he was poisoned by Agrippina, with a dish of deadly mushrooms being the rumored weapon. Who's liked that at the tender age of 16, Nero became the most powerful man in the world. In the beginning, things actually went surprisingly well. The first 5 years of his reign, known as the Quinquennia Neronis, were seen as a golden age. Guided by his wise tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect, Burrus, Nero's administration was efficient and just. Taxes were reduced, and the legal system was improved. The Roman people loved their young, charismatic emperor. He seemed like a breath of fresh air after the often erratic rulers who came before him. But behind the scenes, a dark power struggle was brewing. Agrippina, having placed her son on the throne, expected to rule through him. She wanted to be the true power in Rome, appearing on coins alongside Nero, and trying to sit beside him during official state meetings. Nero, however, was growing tired of his mother's suffocating control. He wanted to be his own man, to indulge his own passions, especially his love for the arts. He loved to sing, play the lyre, write poetry, and race chariots. To a traditional Roman aristocrat, these were disgraceful hobbies for an emperor, more fitting for a common performer. But to Nero, they were his true calling. The tension between mother and son reached a breaking point. Nero began to see Agrippina not as his guide, but as his greatest rival. And in Nero's world, rivals didn't last long. What followed was a series of assassination attempts so bizarre they sound like something out of a dark comedy. First, he tried to poison her. But Agrippina, ever paranoid, had been taking small doses of poison for years to build up an immunity. His next plan was even more theatrical. He had a special collapsible boat designed, one that would fall apart while she was sailing across the Bay of Naples. The plan was set in motion. Agrippina was on board. The boat collapsed as planned, but she proved to be a strong swimmer and made it to shore. Frustrated and desperate, Nero abandoned subtlety. He sent his soldiers to a villa with a simple, brutal order: kill her. When they arrived, Agrippina, defiant to the end, is said to have pointed to her womb and cried, "Strike here," as if to say this was the source of all her troubles. With his mother gone, a major obstacle was removed, but a psychological line had been crossed. Nero was now a matricide, and there was no turning back. His descent into full-blown tyranny had begun. Freed from his mother's influence, Nero's behavior grew more and more erratic. He divorced and later executed his wife, Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, to marry his mistress, Poppaea Sabina. When his old advisors Burrus and Seneca died or retired, he was surrounded by sycophants who encouraged his worst impulses. He began performing publicly, forcing senators and nobles to sit for hours, sometimes days, listening to his recitals. It was forbidden to leave, and stories tell of men faking their own deaths just to be carried out of the theater. For Nero, this wasn't just a hobby. He genuinely believed he was a world-class artist. Then came the year 64 AD, and the event that would forever define his reign: the Great Fire of Rome. A massive fire broke out and raged for over a week, destroying huge parts of the city. As the flames consumed Rome, a rumor began to spread. A rumor that has echoed through history. It was said that Nero, watching the city burn from his palace, took out his lyre and sang about the destruction of Troy, completely unconcerned with his people's suffering. The phrase "fiddling while Rome burns" comes from this very moment, a symbol of a leader's callous indifference. Now, historians are divided on this. It's unlikely he literally played a fiddle, which hadn't been invented yet, but the story captured the public's imagination. In reality, Nero was actually outside of Rome when the fire started. He rushed back and organized relief efforts, opening his palaces to the homeless and providing food. But the damage was done, both to the city and to his reputation. The people needed someone to blame, and Nero, to deflect the suspicion from himself, found the perfect scapegoat. A small, misunderstood religious sect known as the Christians. What followed was one of the first major persecutions of Christians by the Roman state. Nero accused them of starting the fire and unleashed unspeakable cruelty upon them. They were arrested, tortured, and executed in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Some were crucified, others were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. In one of his most depraved acts, he had Christians coated in tar, tied to stakes in his gardens, and set on fire to serve as human torches to light up his nighttime parties. It was a spectacle of horror that shocked even the Roman populace, who were no strangers to violence. After the fire, Nero seized a vast area of the destroyed city to begin construction on his masterpiece, a magnificent palace he called the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This wasn't just a palace, it was an extravagant, sprawling complex covering hundreds of acres. It featured man-made lakes, rotating dining rooms, and walls covered in gold and precious jewels. At the entrance stood a colossal bronze statue of himself, over 100 feet tall, called the Colossus of Nero. To the people who had lost their homes, this project was a slap in the face. It seemed Nero had destroyed their city just to build his personal paradise. At this point, the Roman elite had had enough. Conspiracies began to form against the emperor. The first major one, the Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD, involved senators, knights, and even his old tutor, Seneca. When the plot was discovered, Nero's paranoia exploded. He launched a brutal purge, executing anyone even remotely suspected of being involved. Seneca was forced to take his own life. The reign of terror intensified, and no one felt safe. The final straw came a few years later. Rebellions broke out in the provinces. The governor of Gaul, Vindex, openly revolted, calling Nero a bad liar player and denouncing his tyranny. Soon after, the governor of Spain, Galba, joined the rebellion and declared himself emperor. Nero's support base crumbled. The army abandoned him. The Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguards, were bribed to switch their allegiance. Even the Senate, which had long feared him, finally found its courage and declared Nero a public enemy, sentencing him to be beaten to death. Nero fled the city in disguise, hiding in a villa just outside Rome. He was a pathetic figure, stripped of his power, his friends, and his adoring audience. As he heard the sound of horsemen approaching to capture him, he knew it was over, but he couldn't bring himself to end his own life. He wavered, panicked, and lamented. Finally, with the help of his loyal freedmen, he placed a dagger to his throat. His last words, as he lay dying, were reportedly, "Qualis artifex perio," which means, "What an artist dies in me." Even in his final moments, Nero saw himself not as a failed emperor or a tyrant, but as a misunderstood genius, a great performer whose life was cut short. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family that had founded the Roman Empire. His death plunged Rome into a period of chaos and civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. So, was Nero truly the monster history remembers? Or was he a troubled young man, corrupted by absolute power, haunted by family trauma, and driven by an obsessive need for artistic recognition? The truth is likely a mix of both. He was a product of a violent and ambitious family, thrust into power too young, and surrounded by people who either used him or feared him. His story is a chilling reminder of how unchecked power and personal delusion can lead to devastating consequences. It's a tale of art and arson, of melody and murder, and a powerful lesson from the ancient world that still fascinates and horrifies us today. Thank you for watching. If you found this dive into the life of Nero interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the most fascinating corners of history. Let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like to see us cover next. See you in the next video. The story you're about to hear isn't just about power. It's a story of grief, desperation, and a decision so bizarre that even ancient historians struggled to comprehend it. It's the story of a young boy named Sporus, whose life was irrevocably shattered because he happened to cross paths with an emperor who refused to accept loss. Imagine the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. It was the undisputed superpower of its time, the wealthiest and mightiest state on earth. Its emperors weren't just rulers. They were treated like living gods. Their whims became law, their desires reality, and at the heart of this immense power was Emperor Nero. Nero was a man of extremes, known for his artistic ambitions, his extravagance, and his cruelty, but he was also a man capable of deep, obsessive love. The object of his affection was his wife, Poppaea, Sabina. She was described as one of the most beautiful women in Rome, intelligent, ambitious, and cunning. She held an incredible influence over Nero, captivating him completely. He was utterly devoted to her. Then, tragedy struck. In the year 65 AD, Poppaea died. The exact circumstances are debated by historians. Some say it was an accident during her pregnancy. The famous historian Tacitus suggests Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her, leading to her death. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Nero was destroyed. The woman he adored, the center of his world, was gone. Grief can twist a person, but for an emperor with absolute power, grief can twist the world itself. Nero couldn't cope. He refused to let her go. He gave her a lavish state funeral, had her deified officially declared a goddess, even delivered a eulogy praising her beauty and divine status. But these grand gestures were not enough to quell the storm inside him. He wanted her back. He craved her presence, her voice, her beauty. He missed the control she had over him. But the dead do not return. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Nero, a man who could have anything he wanted except the one thing he truly lost, devised a chilling solution. His mind, warped by sorrow and unchecked power, settled on a terrible plan. He would not just find a replacement for Poppaea. He would create one. His eyes fell upon a young boy, perhaps a freedman or a servant in the Imperial palace. His name was Sporus. We know very little about him before this moment, only that he was said to bear a striking resemblance to the deceased empress. For Nero, this similarity was enough. This boy would become his new Poppaea. What followed was not a symbolic gesture. It was a grotesque, physical, and psychological transformation that sent shockwaves through the Roman elite. Nero ordered his physicians to perform an act of brutal surgery on Sporus. He had the boy castrated. This was the first step in stripping away his identity, in molding him into something he was not. From that moment on, Sporus ceased to exist. He was forced to dress in the fine clothes of an empress. He wore wigs, styled like Poppaea's. His face painted with cosmetics. Nero no longer called him he called him Poppaea. Sometimes, he even called him Sabina. He paraded this tragic figure through the streets of Rome, presenting him to the world as his bride. There was even a wedding ceremony, a formal, public marriage, complete with a dowry and a bridal veil. Imagine the scene. The most powerful man in the world, marrying a boy he had mutilated, a boy he was forcing to impersonate his dead wife. The Roman historian Cassius Dio records a grim joke that circulated at the time, that it would have been a blessing for the world if Nero, his own father, had had such a wife. It's a dark, cynical comment, but it reveals the sheer horror and disbelief that people felt. For Sporus, this was a living nightmare. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, a puppet in the emperor's psychodrama. He was forced to play the role of a dead woman, to endure the affections of a grieving, unstable tyrant. He was given the honors and titles of an empress, but he had no freedom, no identity, no future. He was, in every sense, a ghost haunting the imperial palace, a constant, living reminder of Nero's obsession. Nero's needful Poppaea was so profound that he projected all his feelings for her onto Sir. He would embrace him in public, treating him with the same affection he had once shown his wife. But this wasn't love. It was a monstrous act of possession. It was one man's grief turning into another person's complete and utter destruction. This twisted charade continued for years. Sporus accompanied Nero on a grand tour of Greece, always by his side, always playing the part of the Empress. He was a silent, tragic figure, a testament to how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. The Emperor's personal pain became public policy, his private delusion a public spectacle. But Nero's reign was destined to end in fire and blood. In 68 AD, facing rebellions and abandoned by his guards, Nero's power crumbled. As his enemies closed in, he chose to take his own life. His famous last words were, "What an artist dies in me." But he left behind a trail of victims, and Sporus was one of the most tragic. With Nero gone, you might think Sporus would finally be free. But his nightmare was far from over. His association with Nero had marked him forever. He was passed between powerful men like a trophy. First, Nymphidius Sabinus, the head of the Praetorian Guard who tried to seize the throne, took Sporus as his wife, forcing him to continue the same horrifying role. After Sabinus was killed, Sporus fell into the hands of Otho, another short-lived emperor who had, ironically, been Poppaea's first husband. Otho also treated Sporus as a stand-in for the long-dead empress. He was trapped in a loop, forced to relive the same trauma with different masters. His tragic story finally came to an end under the reign of the Emperor Vitellius planned to use Sporus for a final, cruel, public humiliation. He intended to force Sporus to reenact the famous myth of the rape of Proserpina in a gladiator show, a public spectacle of violation for the entertainment of the masses. Faced with this ultimate degradation, Sporus made his final choice. He could not endure any more. Rather than suffer this last, horrific indignity, the young man who had been stolen from himself, who had been forced to become the ghost of a dead empress, took his own life. He was likely not even 20 years old. The story of Sporus is a chilling look into the dark side of power and grief. It shows how the private sorrow of one person, when combined with unlimited authority, can become a catastrophe for another. Nero wasn't just mourning, he was refusing to accept reality, and he had the power to bend reality to his will, even if it meant destroying an innocent life in the process. It's a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when leaders lose their grip on sanity, and who pays the price for their delusions? In ancient Rome, the answer was often the powerless. Sporus was a boy whose face became his curse, whose life was sacrificed on the altar of an emperor's broken heart. His story is one of the saddest and darkest tragedies from the ancient world, a grim reminder that behind the marble statues and grand histories, there are human stories of immense suffering. Thank you for joining us for this dive into one of history's most disturbing chapters. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more explorations into the forgotten corners of the past. We'll see you next time. Have you ever heard of a love so intense it could topple an empire? Today, we're rediving into one of history's most scandalous and powerful love stories. The affair between Emperor Nero and the woman who captured his heart, Poppaea Sabine. This isn't just a romance. It's a tale of ambition, influence, and the seismic shifts that happen when passion meets power. So, grab your snacks, get comfortable, and let's journey back to ancient Rome. Imagine the bustling streets of first-century Rome. Power is the ultimate currency, and beauty is a weapon. In this world, one woman stood out, above all others, Poppaea Sabina. She wasn't just beautiful, she was breathtaking. But her real power lay in her intelligence, her wit, and an ambition that burned brighter than any jewel she wore. She was everything a man like Emperor Nero could ever want in a partner. When their paths first crossed, there was a problem. A big one. Actually, two big ones. Nero was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, Claudius. Poppaea was also married to one of Nero's friends, Otho. But in the high-stakes world of Roman aristocracy, Marriage was often more of a political contract than a bond of love, and for people like Nero and Poppaea, the Tsar rarely let something as trivial as a marriage certificate stand in its way. Poppaea was a master of charm. She didn't command attention with loud demands. She captivated it with soft words and subtle glances. She knew how to listen, how to make a person feel like the most important man in the room. And when she turned this incredible skill on Nero, he was utterly defenseless. He fell for her, and he fell hard. It's easy to think Nero was just infatuated with her beauty. And yes, she was stunning. But their connection went so much deeper. Poppaea understood him in a way no one else did. Nero saw himself as an artist, a performer, a visionary trapped in the rigid role of an emperor. His advisors, like the stoic Seneca, urged caution and duty. His mother, Agrippina, tried to control his every move. His wife, Octavia, was a constant, solemn reminder of his political obligations. Then came Poppaea. She didn't tell him to be cautious. She told him to be bold. She encouraged his artistic pursuits, praising his poetry and his music when others scoffed. She validated his desires, telling him to chase pleasure and to embrace his true self. She made him feel seen, respected, and, most importantly, understood. For a man living under immense pressure and scrutiny, her support was like a drug. As their relationship intensified, Nero's world began to shrink, with Poppaea at its very center. He started to push away anyone who questioned her influence. First to go was his wife, Octavia. He divorced her on grounds of infertility and banished her to an island. The Roman people, who loved Octavia, were furious. But Nero, spurred on by Poppaea, didn't care. Next were his advisors. The wise Seneca, who had guided Nero since he was a boy, found himself sidelined. His calls for moderation and tradition were drowned out by Poppaea's whispers of freedom and self. Nero began to see his old mentors, not as guides, but as obstacles to his happiness. He was becoming his own man, or rather, the man Poppaea wanted him to be. Even the powerful Roman Senate started to feel the shift. Nero, once willing to cooperate, became more autocratic. He listened less to the senators and more to the woman by his side. Poppaea was teaching him to rule with confidence, not caution, and that confidence often bordered on tyranny. He started silencing his critics, not with debate, but with exile, or worse. The atmosphere in Rome was changing. Fear was creeping in. Finally, Nero did what everyone had been anticipating. He married Poppaea Sabina. She had achieved her ultimate goal. From a noble woman with a pretty face, she had ascended to become the Empress of Rome, the most powerful woman in the known world. Her influence was now absolute. Senators bowed to her. A temple was dedicated to her, and her face was minted on coins. People whispered about her in the markets and in the halls of power. They feared her, her ambition, and her hold over the emperor. But no one, absolutely no one, dared to challenge her position. She was untouchable. Poppaea's journey to the throne was a masterclass in social and political maneuvering. But this was just the beginning of her reign as empress. Her time at the top would be filled with even more luxury, drama, and ultimately, tragedy. The story of Poppaea and Nero is a stark reminder that in the Game of Thrones, love can be the most powerful and dangerous weapon of all. What do you think? Was she a brilliant strategist or a manipulative schemer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching and for diving into this piece of Roman history with me. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the fascinating figures who shaped our world. See you in the next one. Let us talk about one of history's most infamous couples, the Roman Emperor Nero and his wife, Poppaea Sabina. Their story isn't just a historical footnote. It's a gripping tale of love, obsession, and a descent into madness. It's a love story so intense, it would ultimately shatter an empire. Picture this: Rome, the heart of a sprawling empire, a city of marble and gold, but also a city of secrets and scandals. At the center of it all is Emperor Nero. Young, artistic, and dangerously powerful. He's not your typical emperor. He dreams of being a poet, a musician, a star. But he's also impulsive, prone to fits of rage, and surrounded by people who both fear and flatter him. And then, into this volatile world, steps Poppaea. Poppaea was said to be the most beautiful woman in Rome. But she was more than just a pretty face. She was ambitious, intelligent, and knew exactly what she wanted. She saw Nero not just as an emperor, but as a man she could mold, a man whose passions she could ignite and control. Their connection was electric, a magnetic pull that neither could resist. They were two sides of the same coin. Both craved adoration, both loved luxury, and both were willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. Their relationship began as a scandalous affair. Poppaea was already married, and Nero was too, to a woman named Octavia, a respected but plain figure from a powerful family. But for Nero and Poppaea, rules were for other people. They saw each other as soulmates, destined to be together, and they swept aside anyone who stood in their way. Nero divorced Octavia, and Poppaea became his empress. Their life together was a whirlwind of extravagance. They lived in the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace so vast and opulent it was practically its own city. It had revolving dining rooms, ceilings that showered guests with flowers and perfume, and a colossal statue of Nero himself. This was their playground, a world they built for themselves, filled with art, music, and lavish parties that lasted 4 days. They were the ultimate power couple, setting the trends for the entire Roman elite. If Poppaea wore a new hairstyle, every noble woman in Rome copied it. If Nero composed a new song, the whole city would be humming it. But beneath the glittering surface, their relationship was a storm. Their passion was matched only by their arguments. Nero was notoriously moody, his emotions swinging from ecstatic highs to devastating lows. Poppaea, in turn, was demanding and persuasive, always pushing him, challenging him. Their home, for all its luxury, was often a battlefield of wills. One moment, they were inseparable. The next, they were locked in a bitter fight. It was a chaotic, high-stakes romance, and it kept both of them on the edge. For a while, it seemed like this passionate chaos was what fueled them. Poppaea wasn't just a wife. She was Nero's muse, his critic, his partner in crime. She encouraged his artistic ambitions, even when the traditional Roman senators scoffed at the idea of an emperor performing on stage. She understood his need for applause, for an audience. In a court filled with yes-men and political rivals, Poppaea was the one person Nero felt truly understood him. She was his anchor in the turbulent sea of his own emotions. And then, in the year 65 AD, tragedy struck. Poppaea, who was pregnant with her second child, died. The circumstances surrounding her death are shrouded in mystery and controversy. The ancient historian Tacitus claims that Nero, in a fit of rage during an argument, kicked her, leading to her death. Another historian, Suetonius, reports the same story. But others suggest she may have died from complications in her pregnancy. We may never know the truth for sure. Was it a moment of brutal violence, or a tragic accident? But what is undeniable, what every historical source agrees on, is Nero's reaction. Her death didn't just break his heart, it shattered his mind. The man who had ruled an empire, who saw himself as a living god, completely fell apart. He was inconsolable. The emperor of Rome was seen wandering the halls of his vast palace, weeping, calling out her name. He refused to eat. He couldn't sleep. The court officials, who had once feared his wrath, now watched in stunned silence as their leader crumbled into a state of profound, all-consuming grief. Nero had lost more than his wife. He had lost his center. Poppaea had been the mirror in which he saw his own greatness reflected. She had managed his unpredictable temperament, channeled his chaotic energy. Without her, he was adrift. The world that had once seemed so vibrant and full of possibility now felt empty and gray. The loneliness that settled over him was a dangerous, suffocating thing. He gave her the most magnificent funeral Rome had ever seen. He had her body embalmed with priceless spices, a practice reserved for foreign kings, not Romans. He refused to have her cremated, as was the custom. Instead, he had her laid to rest in a grand mausoleum. He delivered a eulogy so moving, so filled with genuine sorrow, that even his critics were silent. He praised her beauty, her intelligence, and declared her a goddess. He commanded that a temple be built in her honor. It was a desperate, public display of a very private agony. But these grand gestures couldn't bring her back. And as the days turned into weeks, Nero's grief began to curdle into something much darker. It became an obsession. He couldn't accept that she was gone forever. He wanted her back, at any cost. But the dead do not return. This is where the story takes a truly disturbing turn. Nero's desperate longing for Poppaea led him down a chilling path. He began searching for someone who could replace her, not just as a companion, but as a physical stand-in for the woman he had lost. His scouts scoured the empire, looking for a woman who resembled his late wife, but they found no one. Then Nero found someone else. A young boy, a freedman named, according to the historians, Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead empress, and Nero, in his grief-stricken madness, decided to transform this boy into his lost love. He ordered his physicians to castrate Sporus, and then he began to treat him as if he were Poppaea. He had Sporus dress in the empress's fine clothes. Icadid Poppaea. He even went through a public wedding ceremony with him, complete with a bridal veil and a dowry. He took Sporus with him on official trips, presenting him to the world as his wife. Can you imagine the shock and horror this must have caused in Roman society? It was an act that defied every Roman tradition, every moral boundary. It wasn't just strange. It was a public declaration that the emperor had lost his grip on reality. For Nero, this wasn't about love or desire for Sporus. It was about possession. It was a grotesque attempt to resurrect the dead, to deny the finality of his loss. He was trying to recreate the past, to force the world to bend to his will, to his grief. Sporus became a living ghost, a constant, tragic reminder of what Nero had lost. Imagine the life of that poor boy, forced to be the shadow of a dead woman, a pawn in an emperor's psychological breakdown. This dark obsession marked the beginning of Nero's final descent. His behavior became more erratic, more cruel. The man who once dreamed of being a beloved artist was now seen as a tyrant, a monster. His senators, his armies, and even the people of Rome began to turn against him. The anchor was gone, and the ship of his sanity was being dashed against the rocks. Without Poppaea to guide him, to temper his worst impulses, Nero was completely The final years of his reign were marked by paranoia, executions, and a growing rebellion. He had lost the love of his life, and in doing so, he had lost himself. His desperate, twisted attempt to bring Poppaea back had only succeeded in destroying what was left of his own humanity. Ultimately, the Senate declared him a public enemy. Abandoned by his guards and his court, Nero was forced to flee Rome. Hiding in a villa outside the city, with enemy horsemen closing in, the once mighty emperor took his own life. His famous last words were, "What an artist dies in me." But perhaps a more fitting epitaph would be about the love that drove him to madness. The story of Nero and Poppaea is a powerful reminder of how love and grief can shape history. It is a dark romance that shows us how even the most powerful person in the world can be brought down by the passions of the human heart. Their love story, for all its glamour, ended in tragedy. Just for them, but for the entire Roman Empire. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the most dramatic moments in history. Let me know in the comments what you think about Nero's final years. Was he a monster or a man broken by grief? See you in the next video. After Poppaea's death, the Roman Emperor Nero fell into a darkness from which he would never truly emerge. His grief was all-consuming, a black hole in the center of the palace. He would spend hours talking to her statues, their cold marble faces offering no comfort. He commanded that her rooms remain untouched, her clothes left in their chests, her perfumes on their stands. It was a haunting tableau, a silent testament to a love that had turned into a destructive obsession. The emperor, who once commanded legions and held the fate of millions in his hands, was now a prisoner of memory. He waited, as if he truly believed she would one day walk back through the palace doors and everything would be as it was. But she never did. As the weeks turned into months, the grief festered. It morphed from sadness into something colder, sharper, fear. Nero was terrified of being alone, terrified of the silence that now filled the halls where her laughter once echoed. He was afraid of facing a world that no longer had Poppaea in it. The man who ruled Rome was losing his grip, not just on his empire, but on his own mind. His desperation grew, and he began a frantic, obsessive search. He wasn't looking for a new wife or a political ally. He was looking for a ghost. He needed someone, anyone, who could fill the void she had left behind. The palace staff watched in hushed silence. They saw the emperor's strange, erratic behavior, the way his eyes would scan every face, searching for a phantom. But they were paralyzed by fear. In Nero's Rome, questioning the emperor's actions, even his most bizarre ones, was a death sentence. So they whispered in shadowed corners and averted their gaze, praying they wouldn't become the next target of his unpredictable wrath. The entire imperial court held its breath, waiting to see where this dark path would lead. Then, one day, Nero's frantic search came to a halt. His eyes landed on a young boy, a freedman named Sporus. What Nero saw in him, we can only piece together from ancient sources. Writers like Cassius Dio and Suetonius describe the boy as having delicate, soft, and somewhat feminine features. It was this perceived resemblance, however faint, that ignited a dangerous spark in Nero's unraveling mind. He wasn't just reminded of Poppaea. He convinced himself that this boy was a living echo of her, a chance to reclaim what he had lost. In that moment, Sporus's fate was sealed. Nero's delusion took hold with terrifying speed. He believed he had found a way to cheat death, to bring Poppaea back from the grave. The boy Sporus was summoned to the palace. We can only imagine his confusion and terror. He was just a boy, suddenly thrust into the center of the emperor's private madness. Refusing was not an option. To deny an emperor, especially one as volatile as Nero, was to invite immediate and brutal retribution. The whispers in the palace grew louder, more urgent. People were aghast at the emperor's decision, but no one dared to voice their opposition. They simply watched as Nero began to construct his twisted fantasy. He didn't just want a companion who reminded him of his late wife. He wanted a replacement. He wanted to erase the boy's identity and superimposed Poppaea's onto him. This was the start of one of the most disturbing chapters in Roman history. Nero's plan was not just to have Sporus by his side, it was to transform him. He forced Sporus to dress in the empress's fine gowns and jewels. He began calling him Poppaea, and even Sabina, another of her names. He demanded that everyone in the court address Sporus as if he were the dead empress, a cruel and public display of his psychological decay. To complete this horrifying transformation, Nero took an irreversible step. He ordered that Sporus be castrated. This brutal act was meant to permanently strip the boy of his masculinity, to mold him physically into the emperor's distorted image of a woman. This wasn't a choice for Sporus. It was a violation of the most fundamental kind. His body, his identity, and his future were stolen from him by the most powerful man in the world. He was no longer Sporus. He was now a living doll, a prop in Nero's macabre theater of grief. The emperor then staged a grand, public wedding ceremony. He married Sporus, with all the pomp and circumstance befitting an imperial union. A dowry was paid, the veils were worn, and the Roman world watched in stunned disbelief. To them, this wasn't just an eccentric act. It was a sacrilege, a perversion of Roman tradition and religious rites. Nero paraded Sporus through the streets of Rome and even took him on a tour of Greece, always dressed as the empress. He forced the boy to receive the honors and adulation meant for Poppaea. Imagine the psychological torment for Sporus. He was forced to live as a ghost, to answer to a dead woman's name, to wear her clothes, and to endure the emperor's twisted affection. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but robbed of his own self. He had no friends, no family, no one to turn to. Every smile he was forced to give, every public appearance he made, was a lie. He was a symbol of Nero's power and his madness, a constant, public reminder of how far the emperor had fallen. Nero's reign was already marked by tyranny and cruelty, but his treatment of Sporus revealed a deeper, more personal derangement. While Nero showered him with the material wealth of an empress, he denied him the basic dignity of a human being. This continued for years. a dark period where the lines between reality and delusion blurred completely within the Imperial palace. Sporus's life was not his own. It was a performance, and the director was a grieving, paranoid tyrant. But Nero's world was destined to crumble. In the year 68 AD, faced with widespread rebellion and abandoned by his own gods, Nero's reign came to a dramatic end. As his enemies closed in, he fled Rome. And in his final, desperate hours, who was by his side? Sporus, the boy he had transformed, the living symbol of his madness. Nero begged Sporus to mourn and lament for him, to begin the funeral rites even before he was dead. It was a final, selfish demand from a man who had taken everything. After Nero took his own life, Sporus was finally free from the emperor's direct control. But he was not truly free. His ordeal had made him infamous. He was now Nero's Poppaea, a figure of morbid curiosity. He was passed from one powerful man to another, treated as a spoil of war. First, he was taken in by Nymphidius Sabina, a prefect of the Praetorian Guard who had his own ambitions to become emperor. Nymphidius also treated Sporus as his wife, forcing him to continue the charade. When Nymphidius was killed, Sporus's nightmare continued. He fell into the hands of Otho, one of Nero's former friends who briefly became emperor. Otho, too, paraded Sporus in public, but Otho's reign was short-lived. He was soon challenged by another contender for the throne, and Vitellius had a particularly cruel plan for Sporus. He intended to use him as a public spectacle, to force him to reenact a violent mythological scene in the gladiator arena for the entertainment of the Roman crowds. This was the final indignity. After years of abuse, of having his identity stripped away and his body violated, Sporus was to be publicly humiliated and likely killed for sport. Faced with this horrifying prospect, the young man, who was likely still a teenager, sua no escape, he had been a plaything for emperors, a living ghost, and now a pawn to be sacrificed. Before Vitellius could carry out his monstrous plan, Sporus took his own life. His story is a tragic footnote in the grand, violent history of Rome. It is a chilling reminder of the absolute power wielded by emperors and the devastating human cost of their whims. Sporus was a real person, a boy whose name we barely know, whose entire existence was hijacked to serve a madman's grief. He was robbed of his identity, his freedom, and ultimately, his life. His story is a dark testament to the suffering that can occur when one person is. Delusion becomes another person is. Reality. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. See you next time. Have you ever heard of the Roman Emperor Nero? He's infamous for his tyranny, his extravagance, and his cruelty. But there is a story from his reign that is particularly dark and often overlooked, the story of a young boy named Sporus. This isn't just a tale of ancient Rome. It's a chilling look into the mind of a madman and the devastating impact of absolute power. Sporus was not born into a world of marble palaces and political intrigue. He wasn't a noble son, groomed for power. He was an ordinary boy, living a simple, anonymous life. His world was small, safe, and completely unprepared for the storm that was about to hit him. That storm had a name: Emperor Nero. One day, the emperor's gaze fell upon Sporus, and in that single moment, the boy's entire existence was irrevocably altered. So what made this specific boy so important to the most powerful man in the world? Historians believe the answer lies in a tragedy that had shattered Nero's psyche. Nero's beloved second wife, Poppaea Sabina, had recently died. Accounts vary on how she died. Some say Nero kicked her in a fit of rage while she was pregnant. Others suggest complications from the pregnancy. Whatever the cause, Nero was consumed by a grief so profound it twisted into a dark obsession. In his sorrow, Nero saw Sporus and was struck by a perceived resemblance to his dead wife. It likely wasn't a perfect likeness, but for an emperor whose mind was already fracturing under the weight of his own power and paranoia, a slight similarity was enough. Sporus became the focal point of Nero's broken heart and deranged mind. He was no longer a person. He was a living ghost, a substitute for the woman Nero had lost. This is where the story takes a truly disturbing turn. Nero's grief didn't manifest in a healthy way. He wasn't seeking comfort or closure. Instead, he decided to recreate Poppaea, using Sporus as his canvas. The young boy was ripped away from everything he had ever known. His family, his friends, his home all vanished in an instant. He was brought to the Imperial palace, a glittering prison where every whisper could be a death sentence. Imagine the terror. One day you're a child, the next you're living in the Emperor's court, surrounded by strangers who are all walking on eggshells. The atmosphere in Nero's palace was thick with fear. No one dared to question the Emperor, no matter how bizarre or cruel his whims became. His advisors, his guards, his courtiers, they were all yes men. Terrified of provoking his infamous temper, and now Sporus was at the center of this suffocating world, the neutst object of the Emperor's fixation. Everyone watched him. They watched to see how Nero would treat him, what role he would play in this grim royal theater. Sporus's every move was scrutinized. He was forced to become someone he was not. His clothes were changed to the lavish garments of an empress. He was coached on how to walk, how to talk, how to hold himself all in a pathetic attempt to mimic the deceased Poppaea. He was stripped of his own identity and forced to wear the mask of a dead woman, all to soothe the delusions of a grieving tyrant. This wasn't just a private matter. Nero's obsession was a public spectacle. He began to refer to Sporus by his wife's name, dressing him in her finest robes and jewelry. The Emperor's fantasy was becoming a reality for everyone in the court to witness. But this was only the beginning. Nero's delusion was about to escalate to a level that would shock even the hardened citizens of Rome. Nero, in his madness, decided he wanted to marry, but Roman law and tradition forbade such a union. An emperor couldn't simply marry another male. So, Nero did something horrifying. He ordered that Sporus be castrated. This brutal, irreversible act was meant to symbolically transform the boy, to make him more womanly in Nero's eyes. This was the ultimate act of control, erasing Sporus's future and cementing his role as a living doll for the emperor. After the procedure, Nero held a grand wedding ceremony. It was a lavish, public affair. Sporus was adorned as a bride, complete with a veil and the traditional flammeum, the bright yellow-orange bridal cloak. He was officially married to the Emperor of Rome, with all the pomp and circumstance befitting an imperial wedding. Can you imagine the scene? The silent, fearful guests, the delusional emperor, and the young, mutilated Sporus, standing at the center of it all, a pawn in a grotesque fantasy. He was given the dowry and honors, typically reserved for an empress. Nero paraded him through the streets of Rome and even took him on a tour of Greece, introducing him as his wife. He forced the world to participate in his delusion. For Sporus, this meant his life was no longer his own in any sense. He was Nero's property, a public symbol of the emperor's power to bend reality to his will. His days were filled with the constant pressure of playing a role, of being the perfect substitute for a dead woman, knowing that any mistake could ignite Nero's unpredictable wrath. But Nero's reign was crumbling. His tyranny and extravagance had made him countless enemies. The Roman Senate and the military were plotting against him. In the year 68 AD, the tide finally turned. A major rebellion, led by the governor Galba in Spain, gained momentum. Nero's support evaporated. The Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguards, abandoned him. The Senate declared him a public enemy. In his final, desperate hours, he wasn't surrounded by loyal soldiers or wise advisors. He was with a handful of remaining loyalists, and among them was Sporus. As they hid in a villa outside the city, awaiting the inevitable, Nero's state of mind completely deteriorated. He lamented his fate, famously crying, "What an artist dies in me!" Even in these last moments, his obsession with Sporus was evident. According to the historian Cassius Dio, Nero turned to Sporus and begged him to begin the funeral lamentations, to mourn for him as a wife would mourn for her husband. He was forcing Sporus to play his assigned role right up to the very end. As his enemies closed in, Nero knew he would be captured and executed. Unable to face this humiliation, he decided to take his own life. With the help of his private secretary, he stabbed himself in the throat, ending his tyrannical rule. For a brief moment, it might seem like Sporus was finally free. The man who had stolen his life, his identity, and his future was dead. But the tragedy of Sporus's life was not over. His association with Nero had marked him permanently. He was no longer an anonymous boy. He was the wife of the despised former emperor. After Nero's death, Rome descended into chaos, a period known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Sporus was passed between the men vying for power like a trophy. He was first taken in by Nymphidius Sabinus, a prefect of the Praetorian Guard who had his own imperial ambitions. Nymphidius also treated Sporus as his wife, attempting to style himself as a successor to Nero. But Nymphidius's bid for power was short, and he was killed by his own soldiers. Sporus then fell into the hands of Otho, one of the successful claimants to the throne, and, ironically, the former husband of the real Poppaea. Otho also had a connection to Nero and might have taken Sporus in as a link to his past. However, Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before he was defeated in battle by his rival Vitellius. Otho then took his own life. The new emperor, Vitellius, was a man known for his cruelty and vulgarity. He had a particularly sadistic plan for Sporus Vitellius, intended to use him as a public spectacle. He planned to force Sporus to reenact a famous mythological scene during a gladiatorial, show the abduction and violation of Proserpina. This would have been the ultimate humiliation, turning his personal trauma into a form of grotesque public entertainment. For Sporus, this was the final straw. He had been a puppet, a substitute, a trophy, and now he was to be a victim for the amusement of the masses. Faced with this horrifying prospect, the young man, who was likely still in his late teens, saw only one way out. Rather than endure this final, public degradation, Sporus took his own life. He chose to die rather than allow his suffering to become a spectacle. The story of Sporus is a deeply tragic one. It's a stark reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, and how the whims of the powerful can destroy the lives of the innocent. Sporus was a victim in every sense of the word, victim of Nero's grief, a victim of his power, and a victim of the political chaos that followed his death. He was never seen as a person, only as an object to be used, manipulated, and discarded. His life serves as a dark footnote in the history of the Roman Empire, a quiet testament to the untold suffering that often lies in the shadows of great and terrible rulers. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as moving and important as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more dives into the hidden corners of history. We'll see you in the next video. Have you ever heard of the emperor who married a boy? It's a story so strange, so unsettling. It feels like it couldn't possibly be true. But in the twisted world of ancient Rome, under the rule of the infamous Emperor Nero, the unbelievable became reality. This is the tragic story of Sporus, the boy who was forced to become an empress. Our story begins in the lavish, corrupt, and dangerous court of Emperor Nero. Nero was a man of immense power, but also of immense and disturbing appetites. His reign started with promise, but it quickly descended into a nightmare of paranoia, cruelty, and self-indulgence. He was an artist who saw himself as a god, and he believed the world was his stage, with every Roman a mere actor in his grand, grotesque play. One of the central figures in Nero's life was his second wife, the beautiful and ambitious Poppaea Sabina. Nero was utterly infatuated with her. He divorced his first wife, and even had his own mother executed to clear the path for their marriage. Poppaea was everything to him: his love, his confidant, his empress. But Nero's passions were as violent as they were intense. In the year 65 AD, during a heated argument, a furious Nero kicked a pregnant Poppaea, and she died. Her death plunged Nero into a deep, obsessive grief. But it wasn't a normal mourning. It was a dark, possessive sorrow that twisted his mind. He couldn't let her go. He lavished her body with perfumes and spices, refused to have it cremated as was Roman custom, and instead had it embalmed and placed in a mausoleum. He delivered a glowing eulogy, deifying her, making her a goddess. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy his deranged obsession. He needed Poppaea back in the flesh, and that's when his eyes fell upon a young boy in his court. His name was Sporus. We don't know much about his early life, only that he was a freedman's son who had the misfortune of catching the emperor. What made Nero fixate on him was a chilling, uncanny resemblance to his dead wife, Poppaea. In Sporus's youthful features, Nero saw a ghost, a chance to resurrect his lost love. But his plan was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Nero didn't just want to look alike. He wanted to transform Sporus into Poppaea. In a brutal act that stripped Sporus of his identity and his future, Nero ordered him to be castrated. This was the first step in a monstrous project to erase Sporus. The boy. Being close to the emperor might sound like a dream come true, a life of unimaginable luxury and power. But for one young boy named Sporus, it was the beginning of a waking nightmare. Imagine stepping into a world where the floors are literally made of gold, where silk curtains drift in scented air, and fountains splash in magnificent courtyards. Musicians play day and night, and servants are ready to fulfill your every command. This was the palace of Emperor Nero, a place of breathtaking wealth. But what good is all that luxury when you've lost the one thing that truly matters? Your freedom. For Sporus, this golden cage was a prison. He lived under the constant, suffocating gaze of the court. Every single step he took was watched. Every word he spoke was overheard and judged. He was forced to become a living puppet, behaving exactly as Nero demanded. The slightest deviation from the emperor's expectations could lead to severe punishment. Imagine the crushing loneliness of that existence. He had no real friends to talk to, no one he could confide in. The servants, who saw his distress, were paralyzed by their own fear of Nero. They wouldn't dare offer a kind word or a gesture of sympathy, knowing it could cost them their lives. The court officials, the senators, the powerful men of Rome, they all avoided him, terrified of angering the unpredictable emperor. Sporus was completely and utterly alone, an island of silent suffering in a sea of splendor. Meanwhile, the man who controlled his entire world, Emperor Nero, was spiraling further into madness. His behavior became more erratic and more terrifying with each passing day. He burned through the empire's treasury with reckless abandon, hosting lavish parties and building extravagant palaces while the people of Rome suffered. He fancied himself a great artist and forced the Roman elitha, most powerful people in the world, to sit for hours on end, applauding his cringeworthy performances on stage. He demanded constant, endless praise. Anyone who failed to show enough enthusiasm, anyone who dared to displease him in the slightest way, faced a swift and brutal punishment. Exile was a mercy, execution was common, and Sporus saw it all. From his unique position at the heart of the empire, he had a front-row seat to Nero's descent. He witnessed the emperor's breathtaking cruelty, his growing paranoia, and his complete detachment from reality. He saw men sentenced to death on a whim. He saw the fear in everyone's eyes. And the more Nero's sanity unraveled, the more dangerously he clung to the twisted fantasy he had built around the young boy. Sporus wasn't a person to Nero. He was an object, a stand-in for his lost wife, Poppaea. He was a living ghost, forced to wear her clothes and answer to her name. For Sporus, each day was an agonizing exercise in survival. He lived in a constant state of high alert, his stomach churning with fear. He never knew what would happen next. He never knew if Nero would wake up in a playful, almost kind mood, or in a violent, terrifying rage. His life was a tightrope walk over a canyon of uncertainty. He was trapped in a world where he was treated as nothing more than a reflection of someone else's memory, his own identity completely erased. It's a chilling thought, to be seen but not seen, to be cherished as an idea but despised as an individual. But history has a powerful way of correcting itself. The scales of justice may grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Even the most powerful emperors, those who believe they are gods on earth, cannot escape the consequences of their actions forever. As Nero's madness escalated, the Roman Empire began to turn against him. The Senate, the army, and the people had reached their breaking point. The whispers of rebellion grew into shouts of defiance. Nero's time, the reign of terror he had inflicted upon Rome, was rapidly running out, and as the emperor's world began to crumble, the fate of the boy trapped within it hung precariously in the balance. The fall of Nero was imminent, but would Sporus survive the collapse? Nero truly believed he was invincible, a god on earth, completely untouchable. But while he was lost in his own world of art and excess inside the golden walls of his palace, the world outside was crumbling. The once mighty Roman Empire was teetering on the brink of collapse. Rebellions were flaring up in the provinces. The treasury was drained by Nero's lavish spending, and a deep sense of political unrest was festering throughout Roman society. The very foundations of Nero's power were beginning to crack. His generals, the men who commanded Rome's legions, were growing weary of his erratic behavior and his neglect of military matters. They saw an emperor more interested in performing on stage than in securing the borders of the empire. In the hallowed halls of the Senate, whispers turned into serious discussions. Senators, once terrified of Nero's wrath, now secretly plotted to replace him. They saw his reign as a disaster and felt a duty to Rome to end it. And what about the people of Rome? The common citizens had completely lost faith in their emperor. The Great Fire of Rome had left a deep scar, and many still blamed Nero, believing he had sacrificed their homes to build his opulent golden house. His endless taxes to fund his extravagant lifestyle had pushed many into poverty. The people no longer saw a divine leader. They saw a self-absorbed tyrant who cared nothing for their struggles. The love and admiration he so desperately craved had curdled into resentment and hatred. The tipping point finally came. The Roman Senate, emboldened by the growing discontent, made a move that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They officially declared Nero a public enemy, an enemy of the state. This declaration was a death sentence. It stripped him of all his titles, his power, and his legal protections. Suddenly, the emperor was a hunted man. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, refused his orders. They turned their backs on him. His closest advisors and allies, the men who had flattered him and profited from his reign, abandoned him in a heartbeat. They saw which way the wind was blowing and scrambled to save their own skins. Even the staff within the palace, the servants and slaves who had attended to his every whim, began to vanish, melting away into the city. The vast, luxurious palace became eerily quiet, a golden tomb. A wave of pure panic washed over Nero. This was a reality he could not comprehend. He, the master of the known world, was now alone and powerless. In a desperate attempt to escape, he fled Rome in the dead of night, disguised as a commoner. With him were only a handful of his most loyal followers, a pathetic remnant of his once grand entourage. And among them was Sporus. Hiding in a villa outside the city, Nero was a shadow of his former self. He paced back and forth, consumed by fear and paranoia. He could hear the sounds of horsemen approaching, the soldiers sent by the Senate to capture him. The man who had commanded legions and decided the fate of millions was now cowering in a dusty room, terrified of a painful, public execution. He never imagined that his life, a life he saw as a grand performance, would end like this, not with thunderous applause, but with a shameful, lonely whimper. When Nero learned that the Senate had indeed ordered his execution, to be flogged to death in the Forum, he knew there was no escape. His pride, the one thing he had left, could not stomach such a humiliating end. He decided to take his own life, but even in this final act, his nerve failed him. He couldn't bring himself to do it, and he had to beg one of his remaining freedmen to help guide the dagger into his throat. His famous last words were a perfect reflection of his lifelong obsession with himself. Qualis artifex perio, or what an artist dies in me. Even at the moment of his death, he was still the star of his own tragic play. With Nero's last breath, the immediate threat was gone. But for Sporus, the ordeal was far from over. In many ways, a new and even more terrifying chapter of his life was just beginning. The man who had been his protector, his captor, and the center of his universe was dead. Sporus was left completely adrift, unprotected in a hostile world. He had no family to turn to, no powerful allies to shield him, and no identity of his own. He was known only as Nero's wife, a living symbol of the dead emperor's degeneracy. The Roman world was now in chaos. The year following Nero's death is known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a brutal period of civil war as different generals vied for the throne. In this power vacuum, Sporus became a pawn. He was passed from one powerful man to another, a tragic trophy to be displayed. First, he was taken in by the Praetorian prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, who had helped overthrow Nero. Sabinus forced Sporus to marry him, and even called him Poppaea, continuing the cruel charade. But Sabinus's own bid for power failed, and he was killed by his own soldiers. Sporus was then passed to Otto, one of the contenders for the imperial throne. Otto had been a friend of Nero's, and perhaps felt some strange sense of obligation or nostalgia. He, too, took Sporus into his court, and publicly referred to him as his spouse. For a brief moment, it seemed like Sporus might find some stability. But Otto's reign was short-lived. He was defeated in battle by another general, before taking his own life. Otto reportedly pleaded for Sporus' safety, but his pleas were in vain. The new emperor, Vitellius, was a cruel and gluttonous man. He had a particularly nasty plan for Sporus. Vitellius intended to use him as a public spectacle, a form of entertainment. His plan was to force Sporus to reenact the role of the maiden in the myth of the rape of Proserpina. During a gladiatorial show, this would have been the ultimate humiliation to be publicly violated. For the amusement of the Roman mob, for Sporus, this was a fate worse than death. He had been stripped of his identity, his body, and his dignity. He had been a boy, then a woman, then a widow, a trophy. And now he was to be a victim in a public spectacle. He had endured so much, but this final degradation was too much to bear. Before Vitellius could carry out his monstrous plan, Sporus made a final, desperate choice. He took his own life. He was likely still a teenager, maybe around 19 or 20 years old. The story of Sporus is a deeply tragic one. It's a stark reminder of the absolute power Roman emperors held, not just over life and death, but over the very identity of individuals. Sporus' life was stolen from him, his body and his name rewritten to fit the whims of a powerful man. He exists in history only as a footnote to Nero's reign, a reflection of the emperor's madness. But his story is also one of profound suffering and, in the end, a desperate act of reclaiming some small measure of control over his own fate. It's a dark and unsettling tale from the heart of the Roman Empire, one that forces us to look beyond the grand monuments and epic battles to see the human cost of absolute power. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating and tragic as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. Let me know in the comments what you think about this incredible story. See you next time. When we look back at the story of the Roman Emperor Nero and the young boy Sporus, it's a tale that fills historians with a profound sense of sadness and horror. It's a stark, chilling example of what happens when absolute, unchecked power falls into the hands of someone who is emotionally unstable. Imagine the scene. Emperor Nero, ruler of the most powerful empire in the world, is consumed by grief. His beloved wife, Poppaea Sabina, is dead, and some accounts even suggest he was responsible for her death in a fit of rage. But this wasn't just any kind of mourning. Nero's grief wasn't a quiet, personal affair. It twisted into something monstrous, something that would destroy another person's life. Instead of seeking healthy ways to heal from his loss, Nero turned his immense pain outward, transforming it into an act of unparalleled cruelty. He found a young freedman named Sporus, who bore a striking resemblance to the deceased empress. And in his grief-stricken, disturbed mind, Nero concocted a plan. He wouldn't just keep Sporus by his side as a reminder of Poppaea. He would attempt to literally transform Sporus into her. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, a brutal and life-altering procedure. He then forced Sporus to dress in the empress's fine clothes, wear her jewelry, and even adopt her mannerisms. Nero didn't stop there. He held a grand public wedding ceremony, marrying Sporus as if he were a bride. Can you imagine the spectacle? The entire city of Rome, the heart of civilization, was forced to witness this grotesque charade. Nero referred to Sporus as Poppaea or Sabina, completely erasing the young man's identity. Sporus was no longer a person, he was a living doll, a projection of Nero's obsession and grief. He was paraded through the streets of Rome and Greece, always at the emperor's side, a silent, beautiful replacement for a dead queen. This wasn't love. It was a horrifying display of ownership and control, a testament to how power can corrupt the very essence of human decency. Sporus's life became a living nightmare, a gilded cage from which there was no escape. While he was showered with the riches and privileges of an empress, he was stripped of his manhood, his name, and his free will. Every moment of his existence was dictated by the whims of a volatile emperor. What must have gone through his mind? Did he feel fear, confusion, or a numb acceptance of his fate? We can only speculate, as his voice was silenced by history, overshadowed by the larger-than-life figure of Nero. Historians of the time, like Cassius Dio and Suetonius, recorded these events with a tone of shock and condemnation. They saw it not as a tragic love story, but as another example of Nero's descent into madness and depravity. The story of Sporus is often a footnote in the grand narrative of the Roman Empire, a small, sad detail in the biography of a notorious emperor. But his story represents something much larger. He stands for the countless, nameless victims of history whose lives were trampled and destroyed by the powerful. Behind the marble columns of every palace, behind the glorious triumphs of every empire, there are individuals who suffer in silence, their stories lost to time. Sporus's fate reminds us that the grandeur of history is often built on a foundation of personal tragedies. He was not just a victim of Nero. He was a victim of a system that granted one man the power to reshape another's reality, to literally erase their identity for his own selfish needs. After Nero's reign came to a violent end, he was declared a public enemy and took his own life to avoid execution. Sporus's ordeal was far from over. He was passed from one powerful man to another, treated like a prized possession. First, he was taken in by Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian prefect who had his own ambitions for the throne. Sabinus also married Sporus and called him Poppaea, continuing the cycle of abuse. When Sabinus was killed, Sporus fell into the hands of Otho, one of the short-lived emperors during the chaotic year of the Four Emperors. Otho, who had once been married to the real Poppaea, also took a strange liking to but Sporus's tragic journey wasn't finished. When Otho's rival Vitellius was marching on Rome, his plans for Sporus were even more horrific. Vitellius intended to force Sporus to reenact the rape of Proserpina in the gladiator arena for public entertainment. This would have been the ultimate humiliation, turning his personal trauma into a public spectacle. For Sporus, this was the final straw. He had been a puppet, a ghost, a political pawn. The prospect of being publicly degraded in such a brutal and theatrical way was more than he could bear. Rather than face this final, horrifying act of cruelty, Sporus chose to end his own life. He was likely still a teenager, or in his early 20s. His death was as tragic and violent as the life he had been forced to live. Today, Nero is universally remembered as one of Rome's worst, most tyrannical emperors. His name is synonymous with cruelty, decadence, and madness. But Sporus, in his silent suffering, is remembered for something else entirely. He has become a symbol of innocence, caught in the gears of a corrupt and heartless system. His story is a powerful and disturbing lesson about the dangers of unchecked power and obsession. It forces us to confront the dark side of human nature and the capacity for cruelty that can arise when empathy is absent. It teaches us about the critical importance of protecting the powerless from the powerful, a lesson that resonates just as strongly today as it did 2,000 years ago. The tragedy of Sporus is not just a curious anecdote from ancient history. It is a deeply human story of identity lost and a life destroyed. It's a stark reminder that history is not just about dates, battles,